The following video was made during the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. This channel fully supports those unions, and this video is a work of critique, analysis, or review, which is allowable under the guidelines those unions have put forward for those wishing to support them. Any praise offered is intended to be praise for the writers, actors, and other creators who make the work, and not for the studio that produced it.
Oh, Angel, what have you done?
So, despite not jumping on it immediately, as pretty much everybody did, I have now seen Good Omens 2, and I do have thoughts to share. I debated whether or not to put this up here or do this as a review in the break room. However, this is a review with a particular slant, and it's a slant that I've done before, and when I have, it's been here in the main channel. And so, here we are. Much like Neil Gaiman's Sandman before it, Good Omens 2 is not only a masterful adaptation like Sandman was, but in addition to that, it's not even really an adaptation, but it also super is. And Gaiman avoids so many pitfalls of this kind of follow-up series, especially on something that was super popular, and I will make some direct comparisons to give you an idea of what I'm comparing this to and contrasting it against. Short version, this is very good. The performances, naturally, are spot on, terrific. John Hamm, while he is exceptionally good at the very, very handsome dumbass, he doesn't always work for me, or at least he tends to work in very limited doses. This is probably where he's gone down the best for me, when he's done this aspect of what he's able to bring to a part. And again, that's not me saying that I don't like him in other places. It's just very rare that I get excited about his presence, but he's utilized incredibly well here. Of course, David Tennant, Michael Sheen, completely nailing literally everything. Every single bit. I love that we get the Metatron back and we get some more of Derek Jacobi in that part. I like that they brought back some actors in different parts, like Miranda Richardson playing Shax, Nina Sosanya and Maggie Service in new roles named Nina and Maggie. That seems like an open acknowledgement that these parts were written for them, which might seem odd since I called this an adaptation. How could these parts have been written for them if this is an adaptation of an existing work? Well, it sort of is, and it sort of isn't. So this is not going to be a breakdown of everything that goes on in season 2, nor is it going to be me cataloging absolutely everything I liked or anything that I thought didn't work. The short version is there wasn't really that much that I thought didn't work. There was one thing that isn't my favorite thing in the world, and that is kind of the approach to the romance angle between Nina and Maggie. Just, it felt a little contrived, a little tropey, but that having been said, it was probably the least offensive version I've seen of that kind of trope of, oh, we need to get these two people to fall in love for reasons unrelated to the idea that they would be in love, and I don't like that as a plot device, but, you know, it's done with a delicate touch. It's done without completely diving into all the associated aspects, tropes, and cliches that I don't like about that kind of story, and it even gets called out at the end with Nina saying flat out,
"My relationship just ended. I am not ready to start another one yet. I'll just be a rebound mess."
So I like that it also gets called out as that was a bad idea. So it's a trope I don't like, handled about as well as I ever expected to be handled, at least to my taste as someone who doesn't like it. The development of the relationships between characters is wonderfully handled. The pacing is great. It is scaled just right. And talking about the scale and scope of it, that's going to lead into what I mean when I say that this is a masterful adaptation. So here were the concerns coming in to the second season. The first season of Good Omens has a completed novel upon which to be based, written by the late Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, and Neil Gaiman headed up that show to ensure that it would be honored and would result in something that Terry Pratchett would have been proud of. Terry Pratchett, his personal friend, who sadly is no longer with us. And I don't think there's a lot of a belief that he didn't pretty much nail that. It's got nearly everything that you would want from the book, plus a new additions and expansions with characters like Gabriel. But for the most part, it is an adaptation that is incredibly true to the source material while doing a fantastic job of bringing to life everything that you want, while also presenting it in a way that is just different enough that it doesn't just feel like, well, they just took the book and just did that, which I know is a complaint not everyone has, but it's one that I tend to have. I get frustrated with overly loyal adaptations because if it's exactly like the source material, my first instinct is I should just read the source material again then. So whether or not that's an issue depends how familiar I am with the source material, and I am with Good Omens. So that was the first season. I was very skeptical about the notion of a second season. Not just because there wasn't a completed piece of work for it to be based off of. There wasn't as solid a foundation, at least not that we knew how it was and what condition it was in, but also Gaiman seemed iffy about coming back and showrunning it, especially because he was now working with Sandman as well. So when it was announced and Gaiman laid out that, okay, there were a whole bunch of notes and a outline for a story that Terry and I had that we were going to consider as a follow-up, and there is something to work it off of that still has Terry Pratchett's ideas, notions, instincts, and story beats. So I thought, okay, that's not nothing. So they're not creating it out of nowhere without one of the major creators of the original work no longer around to contribute. They are basing it off some things that he had. That still felt like a dicey proposition, even with Gaiman saying he would still be involved fairly directly. Then came the interesting hitch. Gaiman confirmed ahead of this season's release that despite the fact that there is basically the bones and outline of what was going to be a second book, that's not the basis of this season. That would be the basis of a theoretical third season. But Gaiman was of the opinion that from where things ended with the first season to where the story he and Terry Pratchett outlined would pick up, in a television format, it wasn't going to work jumping from one to the other. He needed to find another story that he could tell in the interim that, while not strictly being nothing but setup, would lay the groundwork for where things needed to be to tell the story that he and Terry Pratchett laid out. So what we have here is less of an adaptation and more of a made-for-the-screen sequel. But I'm still going to consider it an adaptation because it had to make a lot of adaptation-related choices. And that is going to be, yes, in many ways influenced by stuff that we as the audience do not know about and won't unless a third season happens and we get to see what the actual story was and how much of the groundwork was laid. Obviously, the way that the season ends, if you hadn't guessed already, spoilers are going to be flying pretty freely. The way the season ends very much feels like this is a different situation for any future story to pick up on. But other than that, there might be other things that was groundwork being laid that we just aren't aware of. And we won't know until later. But it's no small thing to continue stories for characters past the story they were designed to tell. And that is what makes this an incredibly smart second season as well as a smart adaptation. Because as an adaptation, it does pick up some lingering threads from the initial one. Not even lingering threads, but just elements that it could play with, such as what we ended up getting with the Nazi zombies. Those are something picking up directly from the first season. Not something I was expecting to happen, but it has its ties, and it makes sense to include them. And of course, there's the continuing relationship between Crowley and Aziraphale, and the way that that is altered and changed by the circumstances that they're in right now when Gabriel shows up with no memory of who he is and what has happened to him. But in addition to that, just not being specifically tied to heaven or hell anymore. And for where they end up by the end, it's quite smart in how it builds that. Because you may not realize it on first viewing, because you don't necessarily know where it's going. But throughout the season, there are plenty of small moments, small hints. You can tell from the way he talks about certain things, just the way he carries himself. Crowley is incredibly happy to be cut from his ties with Hell. Has no interest in them, doesn't miss them. Didn't really like them last time either. He's happy to be a free agent, just do his own thing. He's still grumpy because that's who he is. But then Aziraphale, while he has officially severed ties from heaven, you can see that lingering sense of connection to it. Maybe he misses it, or at least he still believes in the potential of good that heaven has, which culminates in some things that happen at the very end of the season. And that groundwork is laid here. And it's groundwork that makes sense coming off of the end of the previous season. It's a natural evolution that takes characters already adapted pretty directly from a completed work and moves them forward in a way that feels like a natural extension of when we last saw them. This is no small feat. I have read works that are intended as follow-ups after the original establishing author is no longer around. An example that comes to mind is the book And Another Thing by Ian Kofer, which is a follow-up to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books. Now, I actually do rather like And Another Thing. I think it captures Douglas Adams' voice as a writer very well, which is the main thing I really needed it to do. And it also ends on just a nicer note than Mostly Harmless did, which is nice. But you did feel those restrictions that he seemed very cautious and very uncertain about moving the characters forward and shifting them and having them go in new directions. Instead, it was much more about kind of affirming who the reader knows them to be and then giving them a different situation and a different ending. Here, granted, Gaiman is the co-creator, but he's always been pretty upfront that he considered Good Omens to be more Pratchett's than his, which, if you've read some of Gaiman's earlier work, he actually has quite a skill at adopting the narrative voice of other writers. He actually did it to Douglas Adams as well when he wrote a biography about him, which is delightful and is written very much in the style like Douglas Adams himself would write. So it makes sense to me that a lot of the tone and pace and way that Good Omens, the original novel, flows is largely down to Pratchett, with Gaiman sort of adapting his style to match his. So moving those things forward, having the confidence to continue a path rather than just reaffirm, yep, still the same guys, still the same characters. That's bold. And he does pull it off. Now, as I said, this isn't really, strictly speaking, an adaptation. It is a sequel, though. And sequels to things that are completed stories is really hard, especially these days. I would actually say it used to be easier, 30, 40 more years ago, because it used to be that when you got a sequel, be it a sequel book, a sequel movie, a follow-up TV series, they were more rare back in the day, but anything of that nature, they tended to be treated as their own contained entity. Take something like the James Bond films or the Thin Man films or any series of that kind of nature where, yeah, there's earlier ones, yeah, some recurring characters, but like, you don't need to have seen an earlier one to watch this. You'll get it. We're not serializing a story here. These are all self-contained stories. That's pretty easy to do. But that's not the world we live in now. The streaming age, precarious as it now appears to be, coming on the heels of the quote-unquote golden age of television with shows like Game of Thrones before it went to hell, Breaking Bad, which stayed good all the way through, and especially the one I'm going to compare the most with, Stranger Things. There is so much more emphasis on each season telling a grander story that you can't just take your finished story like, cool, that was done. Now we're going to do a new thing and you don't need the old one to have seen it. But the problem becomes, and again, citing Stranger Things in particular, trying to balance a desire to move the story forward while also fulfilling a lot of the expectations of a second season of a show. One of the big ones being, Well, the whole cast is back, right? One of the things that I believe very thoroughly has hampered Stranger Things over the years, in basically to some degree in every season other than the first one, is that not all these characters should still be here. And I don't mean like logistically, well, I mean, they're still in the town. Why wouldn't they be involved? No, I'm not talking narrative logistics. I'm talking utility. So every character who was present in the first season of Stranger Things had a reason to be there. And everything revolved around Will Byers' disappearance. And everybody felt pulled in on that. Everybody had some part to play centered around this central issue of what happened to Will Byers. When we get to the second season, and not only are we introducing new characters, but everybody who lived through the first one is also back, some of these characters don't have a reason to be here anymore. If you take the actual story, the actual narrative being told in season 3, season 2, season 4, don't know why I said them out of order, but I did, I'm rolling with it. A lot of those are going to have characters like, there isn't a reason for you to be here. It varies from season to season. Season 3, I really didn't see why Will was there. I haven't understood why Jonathan's been there for several seasons. Mike has felt incredibly superfluous ever since the first season. It's like the show is desperately trying to think of something to do with him because he was kind of the main character, or he certainly was framed as one in that first season. But like, these later stories don't need him, but he's still there and he feels superfluous. He's a hanger-on. This is a very common problem where there is a belief that because the audience expects everybody to come back, you bring them all back, even if the story you're telling has no use for them at all. Second season of Jessica Jones had this issue as well, particularly when it came to the lawyer played by Carrie-Anne Moss, who had a purpose in the first season and none in the second. But that's where Good Omens benefits from some smart decisions, but also some good fortune. Because if you actually go back and think about that first season, or if you've read the book, it's fairly sprawling. There's Aziraphale and Crowley, yes, of course. And you could say that the heaven and hell material is kind of an extension of either of them, okay. But you've also got Adam and all of his friends. You have the Witchfinders army. You have this medium. You have this woman with this book of prophecies. These things all had utility, and they created a large canvas in the first season. And the second season drops pretty much all of them that are not Aziraphale and Crowley or characters who tie directly to either of them. That's something a lot of shows wouldn't have done, because standard studio thinking is, well, if this was successful before, if we're going to do it again, bring back as many of the elements were in the first one as possible, because while studio and producer and executive thought process is very good at the idea that, okay, find the things that work and keep doing them, it's actually very bad at identifying what those are. And it tends to assume that, well, we should just bring in everything we can because we're not certain which is the thing that people really loved and made it really successful. And we don't want to risk dropping the thing. Or maybe it just needs all of them together. And that's part of how you get all these unnecessary characters still hanging around in so many things. But not here. And again, I'm blaming studios, I'm blaming executives, because that's the mentality. It may sometimes be a choice being made by the writer, showrunner, etc. But the mentality that leads to that decision, keep them around even if we don't have a reason for them to be, just because they've been here when it was successful before, is very much an executive studio or network style decision, regardless of who makes it. So Good Omens, as I said, drops pretty much everybody other than Crowley and Aziraphale and their direct affiliated characters, despite bringing back some of the actors to come back and play new ones. And also recasting Beelzebub, though that wasn't a creative decision. There was a scheduling conflict. They couldn't bring back the original actor. It happens.
Is that a new face?
Well, this old thing.
This is also, aside from being a very smart idea, to narrow the story, because you try and tell another story that encompasses all of these characters again, you're going to end up with one of two things. You're going to either end up with a story where you can tell a bunch of them shouldn't be there and they don't have a reason to be there, which is what I've mentioned, like being a Stranger Things problem, or you're going to end up with something that gives them all something to do, but just feels like it's recreating the previous one. Because if you give everybody a role again, then, well, you've created not a follow-up, but you've just recreated your previous story, even if some of the logistics are different. That doesn't happen here either. Instead, it zeroes in on these two, cuts everybody else, and this is where the good fortune I mentioned comes in. Because while I do think pretty much all the aspects of Good Omens were very strong, what everyone latched onto, the fandom especially, what they loved more than anything else, was Aziraphale and Crowley. And you could narrow it down to them, and in doing so, bring them a new supporting cast and tell a smaller story. Yes, arguably the consequences and the potential fallout are of a similar scale in terms of how bad things could go. And certainly as we find out by the end, like there could have been world-ending consequences to this story, but it's never presented that way. We're not jumping between locations. We're not getting a sprawling look at the world. We're keeping it very much to these two. And whatever else is going on, we're going to focus on them. So we're going smaller. We're going more intimate. And we're lucky that the two characters that it is easiest to build a continued story around, because Adam and his friends theoretically should have an incredibly normal and boring life. Anathema and Newton, they should just be able to have their happily ever after. At this point, the head of the Witchfinder's army should really just be retiring. So there isn't more story to tell these people without in some way feeling like you're rolling back their endings. Aziraphale and Crowley, there's more you could do there. And that's the direction they so smartly went. I do talk about adaptation now and then. I don't zero in on it. I don't hyper-focus on it. There are other creators who do that incredibly well. Hey, Dom, how you doing? But this is a case where the fine points of the ways in which it is not only an adaptation, taking an existing character, setting, and world to build a new story with, but also serving as a sequel to a story that, while a sequel was planned out, that original story was not designed to have one. All of this is so difficult. There are so many stumbling blocks in adaptation in the first place. There's so many stumbling blocks in continuing the story of characters who were designed to only serve in a one-off. There are so many stumbling points for any sequel that is intended to feel like it is part of a continuing story. And this dodges pretty much all of them. I continue to be kind of in awe of what Gaiman has been doing in television lately. And I've respected Gaiman as a writer for a very long time, but I really wasn't sure how smoothly he was going to adapt to the medium of television. A quick note before everyone jumps on me in the comments. Yes, I know he has written for television before this, but those were one-off episodes. This is show running, and that's what I'm referring to. He has taken to it like a fish to water. Gaiman is an incredibly adept storyteller who does something that is very rare and then sort of doubles down on it. The rare thing that he does is very, very carefully tailor the story that he's telling to the medium in which it's been told, which is so important. And that's something I have talked about numerous times before. The deepest dive I did into that was talking about Zack Snyder's Watchmen, if you want a frame of reference for what I'm talking about there. But the thing is, most of the other creators that I can think of that really tailored their stories very carefully to take proper advantage of the medium they're working in tend to not work in that many mediums. Alan Moore pretty much sticks to comic books. Terry Pratchett pretty much stuck to novels. They and numerous others are incredibly talented and incredibly knowledgeable. about the medium that they have chosen to work in. But they tend to refine a mastery of those specific few mediums. But every now and then, you get somebody who can change mediums and shift their approach to really, truly tailor to that. You get people like the late Douglas Adams, who was able to take the same story, tell it as a radio drama, tell it as a novel, tell it as a video game, and also did his time in television working on Doctor Who and did that really well too. And similarly, there's Neil Gaiman. His Sandman, and the way it is told, is tailored to comic books very, very well. His novels are tailored to the written word and to prose. I think Stardust is an excellent example of that. Looking at the differences basically boils down to we had to change the things that you can totally get away with in a book and you cannot get away with in a movie, because the original work was very tailored to what he wrote in. And now he's proving himself very, very good at tailoring his work to the TV format. Although I suppose miniseries might be more appropriate, 6 episodes per season. The second season is literally called Good Omens 2. It wasn't guaranteed. I don't know. But it's the television format. These are not easy jumps to make, especially revisiting a story that you've already done elsewhere. But between this and Sandman, Gaiman is proving incredible at it. And I am fascinated watching him account for things that I see fail to be accounted for over and over and over again, either by the people adapting a work from another medium or by people who have already told a story one way and are trying to tell it the same way again in a different format, and it's not going to work. He seems to understand this. Now, does this mean he'll never screw up? No. In an idealized world, once the strikes are over and both actors and writers are paid fairly for their work and their labor, and hopefully we have less massively overpaid CEOs, but that's me really getting wishful. But at some point, we will hopefully get a second season of Sandman, and we will get a third season of Good Omens, and he will continue to prove his skill. Might one or the other of those be a stumble, be a screw up? Well, yeah, man's human. Not everything he's written is perfect, but his work is not easy to deal with. You can look at the eventual falling down on its face of the American Gods series. That started out so well. It was such a good adaptation, and then it just went to heck. And a big part of why it went to heck was because it deviated and went in some odd directions and kept characters around way past their utility. Sorry to spoil American Gods, but Mr. Wednesday, who is played by Ian McShane in that series, he dies pretty early into the book, and it's pretty vital that he does, but he is just hanging around season after season on that show because he was popular. He was kept around for no reason other than, well, he's a popular aspect, we can't get rid of him yet, even though the story demands that he die. These are the things Gaiman seems to really have an awareness of and is incredibly good at taking into account and adjusting for. And it makes me far less nervous than I probably would be under most other circumstances when it comes to what will he do with another season of Sandman, with another season of Good Omens. I am fascinated by how he is adapting his works, and I really hope that we get to see more. What did you think about Good Omens 2? Did you like it as much as I did? Because I liked it a lot. I know I focused on the adaptational aspects of it, but just like as a story unto itself, it's fun, it's enjoyable, the characters are lovable, there's a good sense of tension, it's got good atmosphere. Very few locations, ultimately, but it utilizes them incredibly well. It's got a very talented cast. It's just well made. And I hope that you will share your thoughts on it as well. And also, whatever you think about what I've said for it as an adaptation. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, and subscribe. Those all help me out. Pardon the fact that I've probably got sweat above my upper lip. We're actually in the middle of a heat wave, and I put on a jacket. I debated not having it, but I'm like, the look doesn't quite read without it. So here we are. I am a sweaty mess. But don't worry about that. Don't pay attention to that. What I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful. You are valid. You are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.
Shout out to the patrons who helped make this possible. In particular, I want to thank Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Tarak, the thing that goes joined to the anime, Ruth, Oliver B., Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernabilax the Poodle, Robin Powell, T. Love, Tracy Scrappett, Angry Kasparov, Dave Hall, and Rosalind Bennett. There's being able to hear me try and pronounce your name, plus a whole bunch of other rewards in the Patreon. You can check out the tiers, but if you're already on the list, thank you so much.